Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Oil prices are forecast to average at $65 a barrel over 2018, up from an average of $53 a barrel in 2017 on strong demand from consumers and restraint by oil producers. Prices for energy commodities, which include oil, natural gas and coal, are forecast to jump 20% in 2018, a 16 percentage point upward revision from October's outlook, the World Bank said in its April commodity markets outlook. Oil prices are expected to average $65 a barrel over 2019 as well. While there will be an over 20% average increase in oil prices in 2018 as compared to 2017, the government has opted to ignore Petroleum Minister Dharmendra Pradhan's plea to bring petrol and diesel within the ambit of goods and services tax and decided to put the plan on the back burner, arguing that the time is not ripe for the change. While most of the states were always reluctant, a Times of India report suggests that even the Finance Ministry is not keen on the move, as it will not lower the burden on consumers but will only complicate the GST regime. Pradhan had pushed the move to consider the impact of higher retail prices. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the impact of rising fuel prices on the economy and how to deal with the problem. Joining me on the program today are Dr. Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Sushil Chandra Tripathi, former Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, and A.K. Bhattacharya, Editorial Director of the Business Standard. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Dr. Virmani, I'd like to begin with you, of course. As media reports have suggested, the government is of the opinion that the time is not ripe to bring oil under the ambit of the GST. Is that the case?
So, very quickly, let me explain. Let's say you put petrol into the GST, then you would have to put it in the highest bracket 28, plus you would have to have a surcharge to get revenue equivalence. In that case, there would be no reduction in taxes. On the other hand, if you didn't have the surcharge, then everything else price would have to be raised. The 12-18% brackets would all have to go up. So it's a lose-lose in my view. You're just complicating the general GST in giving the illusion that you're incorporating petrol into the system. So I think that is a wise move on the part of government. In fact, I just tweeted a couple of days ago that it would be really silly to do it at this time. So, so it's actually encouraging. But the rest of it, if you leave aside petrol and possibly diesel, then the rest of it can be quite easily incorporated into the GST.
Other petrol products?
Yeah, everything else.
Okay, okay. Mr. Tripathi, to put things into perspective, let's first try and understand how oil products are taxed at the moment.
Well, you see, modern life for last 100 years or so has been very critically dependent on energy resources, and particularly the fossil fuels, as has been mentioned, coal, oil and gas. And therefore, the consumption of these items has been increasing everywhere. In the developing countries, in order to become developed, they consume more and more, and developed countries have reached a very high level of consumption. India is still 1/3 of the per capita average consumption in the world. So India's consumption will continue to increase. But at the same time, it is also a fact that among the developing countries, the rate of taxation and the prices of particularly petrol and diesel in India are perhaps among the highest. Petrol is being taxed at almost at 100% of the basic price, and diesel about 80%. It is a fact that about 11,000 crore liters of diesel and about 3,000 crore liters of petrol are consumed every year. So, you know, if you bring the tax by say 1 rupee, there will be a loss of about 14,000 crores. Now, when the government, the present government took office, thereafter the oil prices started going down, and government benefited in 3 ways. The current account deficit came down very significantly, so that in the process helped rupee to appreciate, or rather become stable. But the more importantly, fiscal deficit came down very sharply, because government then raised the excise duty from 3 rupees per liter of diesel to 17 rupees, and on petrol from about 10 rupees to 21 rupees, which gave about 170,000 crores of rupees in a particular year. And of course, the state governments have their own VAT. So that way, it is a very important component in the government's resource raising program. And more importantly, there is no leakage and there is no cost of collection. So I have spent many years both in finance, in central government and state government. So I realized that the finance ministers in the state and the center both would be very reluctant to leave this source of revenue, which is quite convenient, easy to collect with little leakage and such a large amount, and take it into GST regime where the rates cannot be so high. So that is the issue, that is the problem. Unless the sources of revenue increase and the government is able to control its expenditure and diversify sources of revenue and they increase significantly, I find it very difficult that the government will be able to put it into GST.
Sure, point taken. Mr. Bhattacharya, it's a good source of income as far as the governments are concerned, both the state and the center. But where does it leave the consumer?
I agree, but if 27 to 28% of our total indirect tax revenue is coming from these sector, this is a big question that the government will have. Consumers, of course, they should not be left in the lurch, and I think which is why there is need for deeper reforms in the petroleum product pricing issues. For example, if you take the price at which the refineries are selling petrol to dealers, it is right now at 35 rupees. And another 35 rupees are taxes. This is what Mr. Tripathi was saying, 100% tax. For diesel, it is around 28 rupees is the dealer's price, and then another 25 rupees are the taxes. Now the question is, how do you arrive at the 28 rupees price or 35 rupees price? My assessment is that there is a flawed formula of trade parity based pricing that is behind this relatively higher level at which these products are being sold to the dealers. Now mind you, the commission is not very much. 3 rupees per litre is commission for 3 rupees 60 paisa per litre for petrol, 2 rupees 80 paisa per litre of commission for diesel. Now commission is not high. Taxes, I mean, yes, you can say they are high, but for consumers to give them the benefit, and since the government cannot forego any duty, my sense is it's time to do some basic reform in the way the petrol products are priced, instead of relying on a trade parity based pricing, which is the flawed basis, because trade parity means 70% is the import price and 30% is the export price. Now right now we're not importing any petrol or diesel. Now why should there be 70% of import price into the pricing? Now instead of that, if our refineries are goaded into pricing their petrol and diesel particularly in a manner that they reflect their true cost of refining, then probably you will arrive at a base dealer's price not as high as 35 for petrol and 28 for diesel. Remember that Indian refineries, I'm not talking about the private sector refineries here, Indian refineries are among the most inefficient refineries in the world, where around 9% of the crude oil that come are actually go as waste. Only 11% of the crude that the Indian public sector refineries process actually goes for petrol, compared to 25% of the global refineries. Now, Indian refineries are known world over as diesel refineries. Now, there is no reason in a country where your petrol demand is equally high that you will be producing so much more diesel and so less of petrol, as a result of which your pricing is not reflecting true consumer demand, and because you are using a trade parity based pricing, therefore your base price on which the taxes are levied are much higher. If you go in for a market linked product pricing on the basis of which taxes are levied, my sense is the base price will come down and probably consumers will benefit, which was the question that you raised.
Sure. Large scale reform is what we require, is what Mr. Bhattacharya is suggesting. Dr. Virmani, let's not forget crude oil prices in 2017 was an average of 53, now it is at 65. Yeah. Clearly, crude oil prices are on the rise. How do we brace for this?
So there are two issues here. One, if very briefly, on very good point made by Mr. Bhattacharya, on competition. I think the structure of the oil market right now is not competitive. He is absolutely right. I would put it slightly as an economist. The way I would put it is that firstly, the tariff structure it gives excessive protection to refineries. I won't go into the technical details. And secondly, the whole investment in other regime till I think it's still controlled. It's actually not like every other manufacturing. So leave it at that. We need reform. I agree with Mr. The second point is that in terms of he mentioned and he gave the numbers of high taxation. Well, if you look at European and Japanese taxation, there are really two reasons which people don't normally think of. One is that actually optimal taxation says that non-elastic goods should be taxed higher, and these are non-elastic. But leaving that aside, why is that Europe and Japan have higher rates? And that is because of pollution. So you can think of part of this tax as actually a pollution or carbon tax.
A sin tax.
Yeah. So let's move on from there. These are things to keep in mind. Now, as far as the oil price is concerned, I must say that I underestimated. There were some private forecasters saying that there would be a 20% increase about 6 to 9 months ago, in fact. Must give them full credit. But what are the reasons? I think what a lot of us missed was that this whole Iran issue, that President Trump, given all his other interests in Russia and North Korea and all, and China trade, would also go and do something in Iran. So a lot of oil markets are worried about the further sanctions on Iran, which would have a very strong effect on that price. So
should we brace for what happens on May 12th?
Yes, I think the whole oil market is actually waiting for that. But as of now, the only thing from India's perspective you should keep in mind, it's already at 70. So much of the effects that we would normally see, whether it's fiscal deficit, current account, etc., are kind of in the economy, so to say. But yet, I mean, the costs will of course mount up in terms of what you've seen already. But yes, May 12th, everybody is watching out for.
Sure. All right. Mr. Tripathi, oil has been much higher than 70 rupees a barrel in the past.
Yeah.
Now it is around about 65 to $70 a barrel. Is there a need for us to be concerned, or do we still have some leeway as far as prices, crude oil prices are concerned?
You see, we have handled oil price of $120 a barrel. So it is not that we don't have the wisdom or the experience to handle a higher crude oil price. And I agree with those who think that oil prices will not go beyond $80, and why they have risen in spite of the fact that the consumption in Western world is not rising. China also, the growth is not increasing. The fact is that Saudi Arabia and Russia have joined hands. Saudi Arabia is the leader of OPEC, largest producer, largest reserves, and they are changing their economy, which was absolutely dependent on oil, to a more diversified structure under the regime of the present government. And they are also wanting to take their largest company, Aramco, public. So they want its valuation to go high. They have been trying for quite some time, but they were not very successful. But now that Russia, which is the largest producer from amongst non-OPEC, have joined hands with them to see that the oil prices go up, they are becoming a little more successful, and added to it is the geopolitical problems in Syria, Iran, Libya, etc. So oil prices may be fluctuating, they will be volatile, but at the same time, when the oil prices go beyond $60, particularly, the shale oil producers also start operating. So we hope that that will have some kind of moderating influence, but at the same time, we should be ready for a high oil price. In fact, the Saudi minister who was in Delhi recently in an international conference, he stated that his objective is to take the prices up to $80 or even more. So we have to be ready, and I think various measures need to be considered. Of course, we have to take all measures for improving the intensity of
that said, Mr. Tripathi, when should we start worrying? What's the bandwidth that we have?
Well, I think we should start worrying now.
Okay.
This is the time. We have been able to handle this, but hereafter we should start worrying. We need to see how the taxes can be moderated, and also have some, something up our sleeve in case the taxes have to be moderated slightly. We also need to see that the margins given to the oil companies, as has been pointed out, they are moderated, and also perhaps dealers' commission. All these things have been done in the past, and as has been said, we have to generate competition, and there is no need for trade parity. In fact, we export both petroleum, petrol and diesel, so we should go for export parity.
Okay.
That will bring down the prices, and then we, of course, a long-term measure, we have to see that renewable energy and also energy intensity in our activities, etc. So there also we should continue to start working. We have been working, but we should intensify our efforts.
We need a holistic approach going forward is what you're suggesting. Mr. Bhattacharya, the oil minister has time and again said that, petrol and diesel should be brought under the ambit of GST. Why is that so?
Well, that's because I think from an oil minister's perspective, he enjoyed a great run from 2014 with low oil prices, where oil prices were never a political or an economic pain point. So therefore, suddenly the oil prices going up, what can he do apart from saying that reduce taxes? Because that is not his, reducing prices with tax decrease is not his bailiwick. In a sense, it is the finance minister which has to decide on it. So I think the oil ministers asking it to be brought under GST is probably is a brief that he has not yet been transferred to him. Now, having said that, what he can do is step up. A low oil price is often a time when people forget the need for conservation, need for productivity improvements. And I think the 3 and 3.5 years of low oil prices, we have not seen the kind of campaign on improving conservation of oil and productivity gain efforts that need to be made. That's number one. And number two, my point is that this oil price rise, which is going up by 22% this year, and hopefully it will not go up further, as the World Bank study also says that it will not go up. It will stay at $65 even 2019. But this year, its impact on balance of payments will be quite considerable. I mean, the oil import bill will go up from $80 billion to about $108 billion. Now, that's not a small amount. So therefore, if you want to minimize the impact of this huge import bill on your overall balance of payments, what you need to do is to make sure that the prices at which these commodities are being sold are lowered through petrol product pricing reform, which is what we mentioned earlier. And without that, the prices will remain high, and the import bill will also be high. So there will be a balance of payment issue, not very serious, because our otherwise balance of payment is fairly under control, but it will be an issue in terms of a fiscal deficit, because there will be demand for reducing taxes, the demand for bringing it under GST. And as Dr. Virmani rightly pointed out, if you bring it under GST, you are going to see at this point in time a bigger problem. So therefore, my sense is that it is important to look at petrol product pricing reform and try to see in what way conservation efforts can be stepped up.
Sure. Dr. Virmani, talking about whether bringing petrol products under GST or not, if eventually we decide to do that, what are the modalities really?
You asked, so you have to start with why do you want to bring them from an economic perspective, not just because the public is demanding. The economic perspective is that for the petroleum products which go into production, there should be an offset. So the system which I had suggested as part of the overall GST was that you keep it under the basic rate, and that basic rate is offset, but there will be a separate tax on top of that, which you can call a carbon tax or whatever else you want to call it, sales tax, which will not be refundable. That is necessary at least on petrol, but the rest of it you can integrate actually by putting in 1828, because I think the numbers which he has very rightly given, I think with a 28% on diesel, as I said, everything besides petrol could easily be integrated into GST to solve that economic problem. That will not, you see, taxation of the consumer is a choice of the government. You either, if you need X amount of revenues, you can tax petrol or you can tax other things. People seem to think that just because the tax on petrol will be reduced, nothing else will happen. That's not feasible. That is dreaming. Okay? Otherwise, you will have a higher fiscal deficit, you will get some other problem. So that problem cannot be solved, but you can solve the economic problem, which is why people want to bring originally into the GST.
Sure. All right. Mr. Tripathi, talking about energy consumption, moving on to other modes of energy, like Mr. Bhattacharya was talking about, the time clearly is ripe for us to look at alternate fuel and alternate technologies. Yes. What has our experience been with alternate fuel and alternate technologies, and how prepared are we for the change?
You see, it is not something that will come up, overnight or in a short period of time. We have to have a time horizon of at least 10 years. But we should start moving in that direction. As far as the electricity production is concerned, I think solar and wind, we have started working quite well, and there has been a good movement, a good growth also. But there are problems, there are challenges, because even after large capacities being developed in solar and wind, the plant load factor there is only about 20%, and they need a base load. So therefore, coal or gas which produce power, they will continue to be there for next 10 years, 15 years or 20 years. Similarly, in transport fuel, now petrol and diesel are the main transport fuel. There many technologies are being developed, electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel, but they are all in the realm of laboratory, and of course some have started operating in actual practice also, but
not on a large scale and a mass scale.
Electric vehicles, the capital cost of production is about 2.5 times of a similar vehicle which is based on diesel or petrol. So it will take time, and in other countries, particularly USA, China, Japan, they have started working in a big way, but we have to pick up and learn from them and also develop these things.
Sure. Mr. Bhattacharya, do we need a change in mindset as well as far as the people are concerned?
Yeah, I think mindset is required to be changed. The way we look at taxation policy as if the taxes are a way to provide relief to people. Now, as was being discussed earlier by both my colleagues here, taxes on petroleum products are of different type. They are not just to raise revenues. It's a different matter that they account for almost 28% of your total indirect tax revenue right now, but they are also there because they, after all, they are carbon tax. And also you are importing 80% of your entire oil is imported to the extent of 80%. So you are importing something which is a tax on your foreign exchange resources. So therefore, you need to have a tax rate which actually doesn't encourage wasteful consumption. So therefore, there was a time when we used to see a big campaign of conserving oil. Use your oil, there's a precious oil, use it well. Now, I think people should not go in quickly for solutions like reduce taxes, because if you reduce taxes, what happens? Essentially, the central finances and the state finances just go for a toss. Now, if the oil prices have already sort of gone up, and it will go up as everybody is saying, now what is also happening is that we export a lot of petroleum products. Now, our exports have declined. Our exports of petroleum products are not going up the way it should be. Actually, those exported products are now being supplied into the domestic market. As a result, what you are seeing is your imports are rising, exports are not rising at the same rate. So you have a real challenge on your hand.
Sure.
So therefore, there is need at every level to discuss what needs to be done about this challenge from the oil sector, the higher oil prices, instead of going in for what I would call a rather simplistic solution of either reduce taxes or bring them under GST.
Sure. Closing comments now from all my guests, beginning with you, Dr. Virmani.
Yeah, on conservation, because I didn't get a chance to speak, I think the one pending issue is the direct DBT on kerosene. That's a very important thing, and it is kind of been slow in picking up. You must, the point is the consumer must see the price, how costly this is, and why they must conserve and economize. If you give something free, they are not going to economize. I mean, somebody would be stupid to economize if I get something free. So So it has to be given directly, as you have to separate the price from the subsidy. So that's a very important pending reform which will have important effects. It also affects your health if you use excessive kerosene versus LPG, for example, and so on. So that's a very, very important pending reform. The second thing, I go back to the tariff reform, because people don't see it. As an economist, I have to look at tariffs, but the structure of tariffs on oil and oil products is terrible. Okay, some people have speculated it's because some of the importers have too much influence, but I will not get into that. But it is, I have analyzed this over 20 years. It's a bad structure, so you have to reform that.
Sure. Mr. Tripathi, can we ever see petrol products being brought under the ambit of the GST, if not immediately, maybe in the future?
So. I think so.
But will the states let go of that revenue?
You see, you have to ensure that the state revenues are protected to some extent. Yeah? Maybe 100% or 90%, whatever, but to a large extent. And I don't see it coming within GST regime in next 2 to 3 years, but we should have a roadmap of 2 to 5 years when the petroleum products, particularly petrol, diesel, etc., can come within GST. And as has been pointed out, the base rate can be 28% and there can be a cess. I expect that the tariff can come to about 50% for petrol and 40% of the basic price for diesel. But at the same time, the loss of revenue that will take place because of bringing it down from 100 and 80% respectively will have to be met by increasing revenue from other sources.
Sure.
And I hope that in about 5 years' time, anything between 2 to 5 years' time, we are able to reach that position where it can be done. Because it looks very anomalous that we sell petrol and diesel to Sri Lanka, Nepal and other countries, and they sell to their consumers at much cheaper price.
Sure.
And similarly, in all our neighboring countries, the prices are much lower than us. And it is a fact that, of course, the carbon tax has to be there, but it is also a fact that development is so linked to consumption of energy resources, and we are at such a low level that our consumption will keep on growing.
Right. Right. Mr. Bhattacharya, close the show for us with your concluding remark on what's at stake if petrol products are brought under the GST ambit.
I think there's a tremendous efficiency gain if GST covers petroleum products. Remember that not all products are outside GST. There are many petroleum products which are already under GST. There are only 4 or 5 products which are just outside GST, which is an anomaly as of now because it creates problems in bookkeeping. I mean, except aviation turbine fuel, petrol and diesel and one or two products, everything else is under GST. So it is not that big a challenge, but I think as Mr. Tripathi right now pointed out, that we need to set a timeline, a roadmap for how you want to go about it. You cannot do it in today you decide to do it and tomorrow you do it. You cannot do that. You need to create a roadmap for it. And secondly, it is very important that when you want to include petroleum and petrol and diesel under GST, you need to prepare the states as well as the center because there will be some sort of revenue hit in the initial days. And the GST Constitution Amendment Bill actually has already a provision that petrol and diesel can be brought under it without it necessarily going back to the Parliament for constitutional amendment.
Indeed.
So therefore it is possible, set a timeline, and most importantly, refineries need to be reformed, the pricing needs to be reformed.
Okay. All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, what's coming out of this discussion is that maybe bringing petrol products under the GST is not the best thing to do at the moment, but eventually there should be a timeline to bring it under the GST with thorough planning. And also, we need large-scale reforms going forward. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.